Hi, Jim.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. And you?
You doing well? I'm doing okay.
Okay.
You still married? Have you gotten divorced yet?
I have. It's on my 2-month anniversary is coming up.
No, you're married, but you haven't gotten divorced, right?
Oh, no, I haven't. That's very funny. I like the way you make these compound questions to trick people up.
I'm sorry. No, we want to be clear on that. You've not gotten divorced, and you've been married for 2 months. Okay, well, give it some time, Jim. Give it some time. Listen.
So I get up to your level, huh?
Hey, I'm close to the 20-year mark. Yes, that's quite something to aspire to. You've got a long road ahead, buddy.
Okay, very good.
And a fun one.
Okay.
There's some bad news for the Blogging Heads viewers. You know, Mickey Kaus, my usual counterpart, has declared a summer vacation for himself, and he is not going to be back until the political conventions, which are like a month or a little more away? I don't know, late August or something?
Yeah, the Democrats are like August 25th, and the Republicans are like September 1st.
And, you know, that leaves a gaping void in the soul of Blogging Heads TV, and is also... This isn't funny, Jim. It's a gaping void in the soul of Blogging Heads TV. Jeez.
I mean, I didn't know machines had souls, but okay, if you say so.
This is no mere machine. It's an organic, growing, global media juggernaut.
So could I say that I'm part of the soul of, say, the News Corporation?
You mean because you're on Fox TV?
Yes, sir.
That is a machine. That is a mere machine.
So that has no soul.
This is exactly. This is a living, breathing entity with a soul, and now a void at the very center of the soul because Mickey's on vacation. And I mean, one problem is that a lot of our liberal viewers kind of love to hate Mickey, you know. And I had hoped to, in his place, to keep them happy, bring on a series of conservatives whom they would consider loathsome. I gotta say, Jim, with you, I really don't think I've hit the jackpot here because I think you're actually pretty well regarded by our commenters. I mean, you occasionally say something that completely outrages them, so I will try to touch on some things that
lower my Q rating.
Yeah. Whatever I can do to lower the regard for you. I will try to touch a couple of hot buttons later. I want to discuss your controversial piece from a few months ago, the Once and Future Christendom, which you've discussed on here before with David Korn. And then if my plan works out, I will in the coming weeks bring onto stage a series of conservatives who will be increasingly loathed by liberals and ever more loathsome conservatives. Okay, so we're starting with you. We're starting kind of low on that scale.
Starting pale pastels before you go to bold colors.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. And then the momentum will slowly build, and then they'll realize that Mickey wasn't so bad, and they'll welcome him when he comes back. But first, let's talk current events.
Okay.
This Obama trip abroad, I haven't been paying a lot of attention to it. I've been kind of distracted, but you are a veritable authority on all this kind of stuff. So what's going on there?
Well, I think that the most dramatic incident, obviously, was the Prime Minister Maliki's seeming endorsement of Obama's plan. And then after considerable pulling and hauling back and forth, in which the Iraqis seemed to be saying it was a mistranslation. Then they changed their mind again and said, no, it wasn't a mistranslation. In fact, Prime Minister Maliki wants U.S. troops out by the end of 2010. And this has caused enormous consternation, shall we say, in the McCain campaign and among the neoconservatives who've been supporting the Iraq war. But when I heard the news, I thought back to an event that's a little before my time in terms of consciousness, but I've read a lot about since. And that was the 1968 election, when the South Vietnamese government was contemplating the alternatives of Democrat Hubert Humphrey winning or Republican Richard Nixon, and made a pretty, I think, clear-cut choice to help Richard Nixon win the 1968 presidential election because they thought that Nixon would be better from them, in their point of view, in Saigon. Than Humphrey. This is detailed, among other places, in Seymour Hersh's biography of Henry Kissinger, The Price of Power. So now, fast forward 40 years, once again, a little client state in the middle of a war is making a choice about the American presidential election, and who knows if they can dictate it or not. Whereas the South Vietnamese government wanted the United States to stay and fight in Vietnam, I think it's pretty clear that the Shia, who are sort of, I think, pretty closely linked to the Iranians, who now run Baghdad, want us to leave. We've sort of served their purpose for them, and so now they want us out. And the U.S. government, I think, the existing U.S. government is kind of flummoxed by this. So, of course, the hope for, at least by the Democrats, U.S. government, Obama, is obviously delighted.
So you think it was the Iraqi government did this quite conscious of the implications for November, and that was because my sense was that Maliki was to some extent responding to he was thinking maybe more about his own electoral pressures than ours, and was responding to what is no doubt a fairly widespread sentiment that they don't want to be occupied by Americans forever, especially among the Shia, as you said. But you think they were thinking about our election?
Well, I mean, look, the two are the same. I mean, obviously, no country, and this is what the neoconservatives and the Bush administration never understood, no country wants to be occupied by foreigners. Emmanuel Quizon, who was the first president of the Philippines, said, famously, 60, 70 years ago, I'd rather see the Philippines run like hell by Filipinos than run like heaven by Americans. And so, of course, Quizon actually died before Filipino independence, but nonetheless, the sentiment all across the third world is very strong. So, sure, Maliki thinks he'll get more votes and more support, certainly from the Shia, who are the dominant population in Iraq, by wanting us out. But obviously he wouldn't do that if he thought that as soon as the Americans left, he'd be killed. But I think he must feel now that the American military presence, the Iraqi military presence is strong enough that he can, fight some notional civil war with the Sunnis or the Kurds or whoever, or some Shia insurgents, and win, which means he gets the best of both worlds. He can push down any rebellion inside Iraq or invasion from elsewhere, and at the same time tell the Americans to get lost. That's sort of, all of a sudden, Maliki starts looking like a Shia version of Saddam Hussein, huh?
Okay, could be. Yeah, I'll buy that. I'm not so sure that that this will ultimately be the road he follows once he's used these utterances to his political advantage. I'm just not sure he's seeing that far ahead.
Well, who
just
knows?
Like people say about Obama. Once he's elected, once he has a nomination, the Democratic nomination, and they're not so sure he'd really be bent on withdrawing in 16 months, right? And some truth to that.
It's entirely possible. But meanwhile, Eli Lake, who is a smart neoconservative, writes for the New York Sun, had an article yesterday in which he said that Ahmed Chalabi, remember him?
Very well.
Is actually supporting the current plan that Maliki has. Now, again, Chalabi is an opportunist of the highest order.
I was going to say the infinitely adaptable.
But the point is that, look, if it turns out that this whole Iraq war was a plot by Chalabi and the Iranians to get the Americans to come in and remove Iran's mortal enemy, Saddam Hussein, then this will be like that scene at the end of the movie Body Heat, if you ever saw that with
long time ago.
William Hurt, when William Hurt's in jail and gets to the yearbook and realizes that the woman Kathleen Turner is actually somebody else, and he'd just been thoroughly shafted, in the whole process. And I sort of think that's what will emerge sooner or later from the American experience in Iraq.
This may be the first time any pundit has put those two together, Jim, the Iraq thing and the movie Body Heat. I think, one thing that slightly bothered me is this is tangential, but after Maliki made this initial statement that seemed to work in Obama's favor, the Army, CENTCOM, seemed to be involved in trying to get him to do a walkback. In other words, the statement came out of an Army spokesperson initially. Well, this is what he really meant. The clarification came through them and so on. It bothered me to see the Army being used as a kind of political tool, because it seems to me that to the extent that the Bush administration was trying to get him to do a walkback, it was partly for electoral purposes. It was partly for John McCain's purposes.
Right. Well, I mean, Clausewitz would explain this perfectly. You know, war is politics by other means, and so therefore anything that a politician can think of doing, the military would be happy to do. But again, you're right. There's no question there was a bobble, if you will, in the Iraqi policy for a while, as obviously they were getting incredible pressure from Ryan Crocker and Petraeus, and who knows who else. To not seem to undercut McCain and endorse the Obama plan. Then the Iraqi position by Monday or so stiffened, and they're back. They seem to be back to pretty emphatically they want the Americans out. Again, it's all subject to change, but I think the clear intention over the next 3 months and the clear effect has been to give Obama an enormous boost, which made what was surely the trickiest part of his overseas trip, which was being in Iraq, being with Petraeus, and so on. I mean, imagine the converse. Imagine if Maliki had said, Obama is naive or wrong-headed or something like that. I mean, the American conservatives would have creamed Obama as you fool, you went over there, and of course, just middle of the road pundits be saying, how could Obama be so stupid as to let Lindsey Graham and the rest of the McCain campaign gig Obama into going to Iraq? Only to get himself humiliated by, some older but wiser Iraqi government. None of that happened. Obama got away clean, as it were, and now he's, I guess, in Israel, on his way back to Europe, speaking to adoring Europeans.
Now, it does seem to me, I think you're right, it's worked out well in that way, that McCain has made some good use of Obama's time over there. He has used it to really amplify this message that, look, McCain got the surge right and Obama got it wrong, and whatever you want to say about the relative contribution of the surge to the stabilization that we've seen, I think that's a politically plausible and possibly powerful message. And it seems to me that McCain has kind of amped that up while Obama's been over there. To some, I don't know, the utterances sounded to me like they could be persuasive with voters. Did you not think that?
I thought it was a good argument, and frankly, a lot of the media, I observe a lot of liberal bias, but there's a lot of pro-McCain sentiment too in the media, and a lot of reporters and pundits, and Dave Gergen on CNN, for example, was very much trumpeting exactly that line, and also the line that somehow Obama had violated diplomatic protocol by describing what he said to Maliki in a meeting. Well, Gergen was calling that negotiating, and you're not supposed to do that. Politics at the water's edge, and so on. So McCain has an argument there, and it's clear that the surge did, obviously have an effect in suppressing violence inside Iraq. The counter argument, in which it took a while for the Obama people to sort of figure this out, I think, in terms of their own counterspin, was okay compared to what else? Compared to Afghanistan, compared to Iran, compared to unmet needs here at home, blah blah blah. It is obviously with enough troops, you can win any battle if you are willing to forfeit all your national interests and strategic interests elsewhere around the world, and obviously the U.S. can't afford to do that. And so, Obama has a pushback on this, but I think now that this foreign trip is not behind him yet. But I think that the moment of maximum danger, where every reporter felt compelled to go to McCain and say, "No, look, what do you say? What do you have critical to say about Obama? Give it to us so we can put it in the same news package." Now it'll shift to Europe, and then it'll shift back to domestic politics, where I suspect it'll stay for the rest of the campaign season.
There's one question I have about McCain's support for the surge that's probably a little too subtle or something to have any valence in real politics, but it just occurred to me, it's true that, the surge has two dimensions, a quantitative one and a qualitative one. It was more troops, but it was also a specific strategic doctrine, a kind of revised, a good counterinsurgency doctrine that had not been in place early in the war. And this is one thing that Petraeus brought to it. And I would say that that's a key to what success it's had, that it was actually a very kind of nuanced approach to the problem. What I'm wondering is, McCain says, I was a supporter of the surge, and what he means is I said send more troops. But I really wonder, Was he saying, was he championing the kind of counterinsurgency doctrine that actually prevailed? And I just don't know the answer to the question.
Let's nail it down even more tightly. Was he saying that we should bribe all the Sunni insurgents into not killing Americans? Should we give money, and lots of money, to people who have spent the last 4 years blowing up American Humvees in Anbar province? Some people would call that negotiating with terrorists. Some people would call that bribing the people who are trying to murder you and rewarding killers and so on. And now the McCain people and the supporters of the war say, it's sort of as a point of pride. Yes, we have people who have American blood on their hands who a year ago were killing Americans are now happily part of the Sunni awakening councils in the Sunni parts of the country, and that's great. And there is a kind of brilliance to it.
But you're suggesting McCain probably wasn't supporting it in advance.
Well, he might have been, but I think it's worth nailing down, because if Obama had said, my plan for quelling the insurgency is to put the insurgents on the payroll, something tells me there would have been a backlash. It's like saying criminals. My plan for dealing with criminals is to pay criminals not to commit crimes. Right. Now, at one time or another, it's been tried, and maybe it can work somewhere, but it's a hard sell to ordinary people paying their taxes to think that they're paying money. The sort of the slang word to be a protection racket. We're setting up a giant protection racket in Iraq to keep them from killing Americans. Again, it's better than having Americans get killed, but it's probably not a very palatable program to project back to the United States.
Well, it's funny because, and also it involves talking to your enemies, which is not something...
Negotiating with terrorists.
Right, exactly. And it's funny because some time ago I was saying to Mickey Kaus on this show, kind of seriously, that look, what we've seen, to the extent that we've seen success in Iraq lately, it's the success of an Obama-like foreign policy philosophy. Talk to your enemies, do what you need to do. Be sensitive to blowback in civilian casualties in, for example, Baghdad. And, of course, technically we should separate the surge kind of in Baghdad from the Anbar awakening. In fact, there's this whole controversy now about, McCain claiming that, the Anbar awakening didn't start until the surge per se, and liberals saying, no, wrong. The Anbar awakening isn't part of the surge. That's not part of what Obama was skeptical of. And it probably isn't, in fact. And in fact had started chronologically before the surge, before we started anything we were calling the surge. So there's that whole thing. But anyway, it seems to me in a way both of these strategies, even if you don't consider the Anbar awakening part of the surge, this kind of realist but nuanced counterinsurgency strategy that has to some extent succeeded is much closer to Obama's philosophy than to the neocon philosophy.
Well, exactly. I think that's right. And my source, again, is the same fellow, Eli Lake, who I read pretty closely at the New York Sun. He had a piece a while ago, just last week. It's in the New Republic, but he writes for the New York Sun, but disappeared in the New Republic, in which the headline was something like, Obama isn't like Carter, he's like Reagan. Mm-hmm. And I read that, having worked in the Reagan campaigns of 1980 and 84 and so on, I sort of approached this with some skepticism, although it's certainly a meme that you hear a fair amount about Obama and Reagan. Mm-hmm. And as I read the article, I found myself sort of persuaded. I mean, the point that Lake was making, this is Eli Lake now, is that Obama and his supporters, he cited Richard Clark and Rand Beers, who are, foreign policy savants, sort of associated now with the Democratic side, saying that, obviously you would have to work with, sort of shady characters and murky people to complete your counterinsurgency strategy. I mean, just inevitably, doing it with American troops is just too, naked to try it. And so you use cutouts, you use surrogates. And as Lake said, and I actually elaborated on this in a piece that I wrote for the Fox News blog, which I'm sure we'll provide a link for, that this is exactly what this is the Reagan doctrine. The Reagan doctrine was we're not going to repeat the experience of Vietnam. Reagan supported the Vietnam War, called it a noble cause in 1980, but had no stomach for a similar type adventure in his presidency. So instead, we armed the Contras in Nicaragua. We armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. We armed the UNITA forces in Angola. And we even helped in our own way, the Poles in Poland oppose, more peacefully, of course, the Soviet domination there. So this notion that as you said, and this is an important term of art in foreign policy discussions, the realist approach is, you just can't afford to send American troops in, flags waving, like that. You get blowback, you get pushback of a profound kind, as we discovered in Iraq, that we never saw in Nicaragua or Afghanistan or Poland during the time of the Reagan presidency.
Okay, yeah, I think liberals would be smart to make more of this question of would McCain have really supported the Anbar Awakening if you ask him in advance about the principles involved? He loves it now, but that's not actually part of what he was championing. And that's a good meme. Let's get that out there. Okay. I mean, you may not want to, but I do.
No, you go ahead.
I'll get it out. I'll cite you. I'll footnote you.
We're in this together, Bob.
Okay. Now, just quickly, the ongoing global financial apocalypse, which actually seems to have abated a little lately, but I have really not much to say about it. It's just that one thing about you is you usually have a take on almost anything that is distinctive, and so I figured you'd be able to bring in like Tolkien here or something.
Well, I'd bring in Charles Kindleberger.
There you go. Who would have thought? And remind us who he was.
He was an economist, died a few years ago, and he wrote a book with the name of something like Money, Mania, and Markets or something. And as I read that book a few years ago, he just read off first. Then there was the financial crisis of 1829, and then the one of 1837, and the one of 1842, and so, in good Schumpeterian sense, folks, get used to
that. Would be a reference to Joseph Schumpeter.
Right, Joseph Creative Destruction Schumpeter, whose whole point was that at any given time in a growing economy, you're going to get booms, bubbles, busts, and so on. And Kindleberger, more historically and anecdotally, just surveyed all the times of various panics and so on. Now, you can take steps to deal with these things. You can, you try and have social insurance to insulate people from disasters and so on, and deposit insurance for savings accounts and so on. But you're never, as long as you have a free economy, going to get rid of the emotions of fear and greed that are always driving one meltdown or another. So, in the last decade, Bob, we've faced crises in South Korea and Mexico and the long-term capital and the dot-com bubble and. So this is just one more bubble. Again, I admit that it's coming at a bad time for John McCain and the Republican Party in terms of getting blamed for bad consequences. But I suspect 5 years from now, the stock market will, people will be pretending like this never happened, and investors will be throwing their money at, maybe Blogging Heads will have its IPO by then, Bob, and you won't want to. You'll just say, "Listen, nothing but clear skies ahead." Right?
That's what I say right now. When you run a company, you just say that, Jim. I say it every day.
Right, but when you say it to investors, that becomes more.
I'm saying it to them now. So you recommend the Stoic "these things happen."
Well, I recommend having money in cash and not buying not getting too much into subprime mortgages and so on but yes, you can escape history if bubbles and cycles have happened all through history, then nothing in the future is going to eliminate them other than death.
Okay. I personally hope that McCain takes your advice and just his next thing he says about the economy is, "Hey, these things happen."
No, I didn't say that politically.
No.
Obviously, politically, you have to. You can't
have
do
to say these things don't happen, and it's somebody's fault, and we'll find them and kill them.
We're gonna fix it. But I was just talking to a friend of mine today about the anti-speculation legislation that Schumer and so on in the U.S. Senate are coming up with, and apparently his comment was it's a big nothing burger that for all the chest thumping rhetoric the Democrats are using about we're going to stop speculators driving up the price of oil and so on. In fact. There are virtually no changes whatsoever in the current system because, of course, the biggest profit center on Wall Street now is of all things, oil speculation. Yeah. They do it in London, but it's still under the umbrella of Goldman Sachs or whoever, and so they have no intention of stopping unless they have to. And then so they've gone to Senator Schumer and said, "Look, come up with some facade legislation that satisfies the bubbas out there that we're doing something about." Speculation, but don't actually do anything like changing the margin requirements or anything like that would actually inhibit our ability to speculate further in the future.
Okay, speaking of oil prices, you've got this T. Boone Pickens thing you want to talk about, right?
Well, I mean, I think it's...
Now, first of all, can you remind our younger viewers, what did he become famous for? Is it he was a corporate raider, or...
He became famous, as sort of a corporate raider. That would be what his enemies would call him, or champion of the shareholders, which is what he himself would call himself. Yeah. No, I mean, Pickens has been a major figure in American sort of business for 30 years now, and years and years ago looked ahead and saw that oil prices and energy prices were going to rise rapidly, and so, by all accounts, has made billions and billions and billions on higher energy prices. And now, if anybody watching cable news knows, the Pickens plan, www.pickensplan.com, is on TV all over the place, in which Pickens calls for a much greater commitment to wind and natural gas as two parts of an energy program, and I think he's had an enormous effect on the public debate. I mean, obviously, he's not alone. Newt Gingrich has got this drill now, drill here, pay less petition, which he began in May, and then early in July submitted 1.4 million signatures. That's 1.4 million is a lot of people, Bob. I mean, it's just a lot of people on short notice, and so for all these sort of conservative pro-energy, pro-growth, pro-drilling, pro-production brush fires to catch on like this, I think has very much transformed the debate that smug liberals were content to think was now going to be totally dominated by Al Gore and the polar bears and the penguins.
Well, on the other hand,
and the anti-global warming.
On the other hand, some things these smug liberals have been recommending for years, like developing alternative energies, that's partly what T. Boone Pickens is advocating, and it's looking like it wouldn't have been such a bad idea to develop at least some of them. I mean, some of them might have been boondoggles, but, right? I mean, it would be nice if we were a little more insulated from dependence on oil.
Look, it'd be great. Of course, you don't have to be a liberal to think that. I mean, there's plenty of Hamiltonian
right, but they were thinking
like
it first.
Me.
I mean,
well, Alexander Hamilton was thinking it before any of them. But I mean, look, if you on close inspection, the environmental movement, when they have a chance to do wind power off of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, they oppose that.
Well, come on, wait a second. That's the Kennedys opposed it because they owned property there. That wasn't like that wasn't like liberals en masse. That was
well, I mean, did the liberals en masse say that Teddy Kennedy and John Kerry, both of whom were jointly protesting, you're making us look bad, you're making us look like hypocrites?
That's just what I said to them, but they didn't listen.
Fair enough. It might be what you said, but the point is, where was the Sierra Club?
Yeah, I don't know. You may be right that there's some internal brother-in-law going on there that shouldn't be, but it's not as if I wouldn't call that reaction a liberal one per se. Anyway.
Okay, and then when they wanted to build solar panels in California, and they had to build transmission. Again, you put the solar panels in the desert somewhere, and then you need a transmission line to get the power to where people live. And, of course, that was opposed, too. So the point is, Al Gore and the Greens came along 3 or 4 or 5 years ago and said, look, the single biggest issue facing the world is global warming. And, the inconvenient truth, when the Oscar, when the Nobel Peace Prize, was the apple of liberal opinion. And then, all of a sudden, just in the last 6 months, people said, hey, actually, when people are confronted with a choice between $4 gasoline and the penguins, they choose lower gas prices. And again, we can talk. I'm not here to talk about the science of this. I mean, Bob, you're recognized as an expert science journalist.
You're actually the first person who's ever recognized me as one, and with good reason.
No.
But
your book, Three Scientists and Their Gods, is something I read, 20 years ago. Whenever it was.
Oh, God bless you.
It was quite good, and I'm sure it's on Amazon, in the used book section for like 4 cents a copy.
Jim. Or our relationship was going so well until like 20 seconds ago. Where did that come from, man?
You can buy it direct from Bob. I'm sure he'll sell you for $20.
A signed copy for $0.25, man. Jeez, give me a break.
In any case, without talking about the science one bit, the politics have shifted. I think have shifted dramatically, and so the Democrats, who I think thought they were going to get some sort of cap and trade legislation through the U.S. Congress in 2008, I don't think they'll even get it through during the course of an Obama presidency, if there is one.
Well, okay, I would just point out that tons of things that these Greens were proposing years ago actually have, I think, been vindicated by the oil crisis. And I don't just mean the development of alternative energies. I mean energy conservation. I mean mass transit that saves on energy. I mean, I think if we had just followed their prescription for all the folly that it might have led to in certain areas, like maybe ethanol's not a great idea or something. I don't know which ones are good and which ones are bad. I just think we'd be in better shape.
We might well be, and I didn't say. Look, I'm not opposed. I love mass transit. I love bullet trains. I think we should have bullet trains like they have in Europe and Japan, all over this country. It would save. Not only would it be good for the environment, it would be good for travelers. If you could get to New York in an hour, just from Amtrak station to Amtrak station. No, we should definitely be doing this. But when I said I put the modifier smug in there to deal with the people who oppose wind farms because it spoils their view as they're drinking Bloody Marys at Martha's Vineyard.
I still say that's a special case. Now you're right that they don't want to drill for a lot of oil, but I think the jury's out.
And they don't want nuclear power, which I think is
that's
I think
a tough
everybody's
one.
starting to recognize now as the only solution. It works in France, it works elsewhere in Europe. I read somewhere the Ukrainians are building 45 nuclear power plants now. Whatever concerns we have about nuclear power, the Ukrainians, which is the home to Chernobyl, have more. And they're doing it anyway because they just need it. It's just necessary.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, if you can make them truly safe, and if you can truly eliminate the risk that some of the nuclear material will wind up in the hands of terrorists, and I'm more confident of doing that in America than in some of the other places you've mentioned, but
right.
Then and you can figure out a way to dispose of the fuel, I'm fine with that. I agree that's something that liberals have to work out, but it's not as if none of them are seriously entertaining the possibility in light of global warming.
You're right, some are. Patrick Moore, who's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, has become a nuclear power advocate. But I would say this. I think an honest answer. Now, Bob, you're well known as an honest man, so let's have an honest answer to this question. If nuclear power were safe, would the environmentalists support it? The hardcore Greens?
Well, you're probably defining hardcore Greens to be synonymous with those people who would continue to say no. I mean, I
think the Sierra Club would oppose it no matter what.
I think if you could really convince people that it really would be safe, you would win some converts from the liberal side. Not all of them, but I don't know. It is an issue that it's a legitimate issue. But in general, I would also say, look, the jury's out. I mean, Newt Gingrich may have gotten 1.4 million signatures, but there are still a lot of people on the West Coast who do not want. Who I personally was in San Francisco for the big oil spill. I remember kids from my junior high being dismissed from class. This is classic kind of 1970 or 71, whatever it was, liberal kind of naivete, I think, because the kids were being dismissed from class to go to the beach and clean off the seagulls. No doubt they used some solvent that killed them faster than they would have died, right? But still, the thought was there. Anyway, I remember this, and I'm telling you, there are a lot of people on the West Coast who are not eager to have more drilling off the shore, and that includes a lot of right-wing property owners. I'll bet you anything.
I'm sure you're right, and obviously the technology for oil drilling, like so many other things, has gotten a lot better. It's notable that when Hurricane Katrina blew through the Gulf of Mexico, not a single oil rig was destroyed or damaged. So in other words, they're much better at this than they were 40 years ago when the big spill off of Santa Barbara. But I think that meanwhile, the polls, I just saw a poll this morning and said 77% of people support drilling. So 23% can be in California and Oregon and Massachusetts and wherever, and that's fine. But 77% are saying the opposite. I mean, this reminds me a little bit of the 1952 presidential election, where Adlai Stevenson, representing the New Deal and liberalism, said, well, obviously, any revenues that come from offshore oil drilling, in this case from the Gulf of Mexico, should go to the federal government. And as I recall, it was Governor Shivers of Texas who said, the hell with this. We want the money for us. And Eisenhower won Texas for the first time in a long time as a Republican. So in other words, sometimes these issues there's a smug presumption about how things ought to go that congeals and hardens in places like Washington and New York. And it needs a collision with voters out there in heartland America to say, well, actually, the majority rules. And what you guys want in Manhattan isn't what we want here in the rest of the country.
Well, the last thing I'd say is leaving the politics aside. I do think the jury's out about a lot of these issues. Leaving the politics aside, as a matter of policy, maybe you'll agree with me, it isn't the case that what we most need is to lower our gasoline prices, really. I think what we need is to, as a matter of policy, is if anything, to raise them, to raise the cost of oil and get us to once and for all seriously confront the need to wean ourselves off of oil per se, first of all, for a number of reasons. Because oil, there's a separate reason to not be dependent on Middle East oil, right? There's a geopolitical reason, leaving aside all short-term considerations, leaving aside global warming.
Boone Pickens makes a point in his commercial that we're sending $700 billion a year over to the you-know-who's. And this can't be good for American national security.
What, Arabs?
OPEC.
Oh, OPEC? Okay.
But, I mean, and half of that's going to the Persian Gulf. I mean, what do we think the Saudi Arabians and the Kuwaitis and the, madrasas and whoever are doing with our money? We know the answer. We found out on 9/11.
Well, we're
just waiting for the next one.
This is a good segue to wanting to talk about your Christendom piece, because you can probably see the segue. I mean, lessening our dependence, our economic dependence on parts of the world that are largely Muslim would seem consistent with your prescription in this piece. You published this in the American Conservative actually now it's been a while, September of 2007.
September 10th, I think. September 10th.
September 10th, one day before some sort of anniversary of 9/11, I guess.
Right.
And I spent most of the time since it was published not reading it. And just getting any sense of it through secondary sources, like listening to you and David Korn argue about it on Blogging Heads. I actually read it today, you'll be happy to hear, and I was kind of hoping I would find these super incendiary phrases that I could confront you with. There may be some of those, but it's mainly what I find myself wanting more is for you to actually put some meat on the bones. It kind of wasn't as clear to me what exactly the policy implications are. Let me give my kind of brief summary of your argument. Okay, first of all, you buy into the Clash of Civilizations model as a descriptive but not a prescriptive kind of guide, right? In other words, you think, yes, there is this clash of civilizations between the West and the Muslim world. My own view, as a footnote, is we're closer to that than we were when Huntington wrote it, but that's largely because to some extent, because we've thought of the world that way and made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyway, let's not get into that argument. Anyway, you buy that as an almost, I think you, like Huntington, see it as an almost natural dynamic.
Right. I mean, Huntington, Clash of Civilization blew away Nonzero. I guess is the way we could sum it up.
No, actually, I maintain, now this is truly a tangent. I maintain if you read Nonzero, which was published the year before 9/11, it holds up pretty well.
Okay.
And you read it before, and I know you...
No, I'm a fan of the book, but I think it's a little bit overtaken by events.
No, read it again. I'm telling you, I'll send you the passages. It talks about how the big threat is the way technologies would empower small groups to cause large amounts of damage, and so on. I could go on with a defense of Nonzero, but
I put them up on the PDF if you want.
I should. I think there's some of them on the Nonzero site. Anyway, enough about me, Jim. Let's talk about your writing.
Okay.
Actually, we should link to my Slate review of Huntington's book too.
Okay.
Anyway, so you kind of buy it as a natural dynamic, but you don't advocate waging the war. And in fact,
no, absolutely.
In fact, you were not a supporter of the Iraq invasion, which is unusual among card-carrying conservatives like yourself.
Right, although not unusual among non-neocon conservatives.
Right, in some ways you could argue it's in keeping with mainstream conservative foreign policy, certainly kind of realist foreign policy.
Right.
But so what you do want to do is kind of separate ourselves from the Muslim world, and I'm not sure what you use the word quarantine at some point. You write an eye toward feasible strategies of containment, even quarantine. And I'm wondering, what does this entail? I mean, do you want us to not do economic business with them? I mean, what would we be doing differently? I mean, there's first of all the whole question of who the we is. You're talking about Christendom, and that's a dimension I want to address if we have time in a little bit. You're talking about almost a revival of the notion of Christendom as this coherent entity, this coherent even political entity, which Okay, that's a big question itself.
I do. I think it'd be great.
But okay, we'll get into that. But first, what would we be doing differently with the Muslim world?
Let me just step back 1 second. And this really hit me. And as a Christian, I thought to myself, okay, how would I feel? I'm a Protestant, but how would I feel if present trends continue in Italy and Italy becomes a Muslim country somewhere in the next 100 years or a couple hundred years?
Through immigration, you mean?
Through immigration and higher differential birth rates and so on. And then some hypothetical Taliban-type regime in Italy decided to dynamite the Vatican. Just the way they did those statues in Afghanistan back in 2001, just before 9/11, the bombing on Buddha statues and so on. I said, well, that would feel pretty lousy. I think that would be a wound. And what I thought to myself was, that would be like the blade of Morgul in Frodo in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, you have this whole token thing running through this piece, which I hadn't expected. But
I do have this whole token thing, and I thought, well, yeah. So I don't want that. I don't want Christianity to suffer this mortal wound. And of course, I also don't want to see Jerusalem get nuked. Not just by the Taliban dynamiting it, but by some A-bomb coming down on top of them. I mean, I think that would be bad. Again, not only for the people and the tragedy of the people involved, but just for the cultural, historical, sacredness of the place and so on. So then I thought, okay, if we really were serious about defending these sacred Christian places, we'd have to rethink our strategy, wouldn't we? Because the current path of Israel getting in these endless confrontations with Iran isn't working out. We can sort of see where that one's headed down the road in terms of hair triggers. The current path of having Europe with a heavy influx of Muslims isn't going to work out well for the Christian heritage of Europe. So okay, now let's step back a second. Now, how did people deal with this in the past? And that's what led me to containment, quarantine, whatever, and to match that thought up with other ideas, means to floating around the culture, like energy independence. I mean, I think for lots of reasons, which have nothing to do with my article, smart people have come together, and this includes, at least in theory, John McCain and Barack Obama. Well, of course we're going to have energy independence. I worked for Mike Huckabee earlier in 2008.
Hey, by the way, could you get Huckabee on Blogging Heads, do you think?
Maybe.
Okay, we should talk about that.
He's got plenty to say.
Okay, sorry.
He's very entertaining. But in any case, Huckabee said all the time, I want energy independence for America in 10 years. We could build an A-bomb, we could build a space program, we could do this if we wanted to. And I think a lot of people think that way for lots of good reasons. Whether it's sort of a Hamiltonian approach to jobs, whether it's to defund Al Qaeda, and lots of good reasons. And then I said, okay, that's one obvious answer is energy independence.
Okay, but that's not especially controversial. A lot of people would buy that.
Not especially.
Presumably restrictive immigration policy in European countries, for starters. I know you favor more restrictive enforcement, at least here.
I do. I support it there too. I think more to the point, they do. More to the point, I think the Europeans have woken up and realized, what's going to happen if France and Germany and Italy and Spain are Muslim countries in 100 years. Well, they won't be France and Germany and Spain anymore. It'll be something else.
Well,
and so they've kind of woken up to this demographic reality that they got to fix and they got to address.
Of course.
So now, then I thought to myself, further, what's sort of paradoxical about the situation that Christians face is that the Christians they're basically Christendom is now divided into 4 big parts. Now, again, and using sort of Huntingtonian terminology, with all deference to him, the 4 Christian zones, if you will, are Russia, is its own distinct civilization. The West, which includes Western Europe Europe and America and New Zealand and Australia and Canada and so on. Latin America as a distinct Christian civilization, and of course Africa, where there's something like 400 million Christians. Now, in 3 of those places, Europe, Russia, and Africa, they are up against sort of what Huntington called the bloody borders of Islam. There's fighting and skirmishing, in Chechnya. There's unrest in Europe, and all along the 10th parallel, which sort of runs through Africa. Nigeria, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia. There's conflicts there too.
Not all of them. I would think not all of them are along Christian versus Muslim lines. An example is Sudan, and also right. Some of them are as much nationalist as they are religious. I would argue, for example, Chechnya. But go ahead.
I would say that in many cases. Islam and nationalism and Christianity and nationalism are synonymous. I mean,
well, and you'd like to make them more so.
I think it's just reality. And so, in other words, so then I thought to myself, okay, what needs to happen for the defense of these places, if they don't get overwhelmed, and oil goes to $500 a barrel or something like that, and the Saudi Arabians have $50 trillion of money to spend on doing whatever they spent the last zillion dollars they've taken in from the West and Japan Wahhabi evangelization and so on. Well, okay, let's get smart here, folks. Let's think seriously and strategically about how we would prevent Russia and Europe and Africa from being overwhelmed by Muslims. And the answer to that, I oppose the Iraq War. I oppose invading other people's countries. What I came to think of it as, well, this is like in Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, what I call the Shire strategy, which is, Frodo and his friends defended their Shire against various invaders and along the way destroyed the ring and so on. But the point is, the main thing they wanted was to defend their territory, their home, their Shire, against the bad guys. And, 3 books later, they succeeded. And it's, and I think that model, look, folks, this is ours. We're not saying we're better. We're not saying anything. But we are saying this is ours, and we're going to defend it. And I think that's a pretty good approach. And that's what that took me 6,000 words in the American Conservative magazine to spell it out.
Okay, but let's get back to policy prescription. First thing I'd say is when you say, what if Muslims take over Italy and then blow up the Vatican? I mean, there are a couple of assumptions there underlying the belief that it's plausible that they could take over Italy. One is that current demographic trends would continue, and one thing we know about demographic projections is they never are accurate. They never continue. Something changes. Very often birth rates...
Sometimes they're accurate.
Well,
some
usually they're not, and often birth rates of specific demographic groups decline if, in particular, they enter the middle class and adopt middle class values. Anyway, the other thing I'd say is, even if you accept that, okay, the day would come if immigration policies aren't changed when a majority of Italy was Muslim, that's not the same as saying that a majority of Italy would be people who want Italy to become an Islamic state. There are a lot of Muslims in America now. I just don't hear a lot of them saying, let's turn America into a Muslim state. Now, granted, demographically, we have inherited a more upscale demographic than much of Europe does. But at the same time, that's to some extent a matter of immigration policy. And, as you know, European states will adapt to some extent themselves their immigration policy as needs dictate. So
I think they certainly will. I mean, look. It's just obviously, Bob, history, including places like the Balkans and stuff, just suggests that Christians and Muslims don't coexist very well in the same country, like the former Yugoslavia.
They're actually doing okay in America.
Bob, but there's nothing close to equality here.
What do you mean?
How many Muslims? There are a lot of Arabs in America, including a lot of Arab Christians, they're probably the biggest chunk. How many genuine Muslims are there in America now? Because there's a few million.
Yeah, well.
But how would things be in America if there were 100 million Muslims? Would it be different?
I don't know, but I don't think I'll be around to see it, and things will be so...
Answer the question. How would America be different?
Depends on the Muslims. If they're like the Muslims we have now, I don't think America would have become a Muslim state. That doesn't seem to be the aspiration of most of them.
I think there'd be conflict.
Well,
it's not their fault. They are the way they are, and we are the way we are.
But I don't know. I just Jim?
The difference is that places like Saudi Arabia. I mean, Steve Schwartz's book, The Two Faces of Islam, that was very persuasive and very interesting, and so un-PC that even 7 or 8 years later, even after 9/11, people don't quite deal with it. Look, the Saudi Arabians are busy financing propaganda and evangelization all over the world through the Wahhabi sect.
I think that's not entirely true, actually, the way you've put it. If you're saying that... I think they're not propagandizing on behalf of jihad, and if that's what you mean.
No, I said the Wahhabi sect.
Okay.
All right, and 10 miles from where I'm sitting right now in McCain, Virginia, which is a suburb of Washington, D.C., there is a Saudi Arabian-funded school where they've gone in the textbooks. And the textbooks are, kill Jews, kill infidels, all the kind of standard stuff that a raw religion, unreconstructed by better angels of nature, is actually what they say.
Well, first of all, religions.
So now how can that be? How can it be good for those kind of people to be flourishing and propagating and evangelizing inside the United States?
I don't know.
How can that be good?
But first of all, if there's several million of them, and essentially nothing bad has happened by virtue of their presence here in all the years they've been here, I just don't see this as the kind of intrinsic problem. You see the.
How about Madrid, Spain, or London?
That's Madrid, Spain.
Okay. Do you see a connection? Do you see any kind of linkage there at all?
To American Muslims?
You're being pretty PC here. I mean, you can choose to be that, but I'm just going to call you PC. If you want to be so PC as to deny the ethnic link in anti-Western...
Well, there's certainly an ethnic correlation,
violence.
and we certainly have a big PR problem in the Muslim world. There's no doubt about that. And I'm not denying any of that. I just think I think I said to you in an email, your worldview is like mine, kind of apocalyptic, but in a different way. And I just think you see these trends and see the apocalypse coming where there's all kinds of evidence that I don't know, Muslims in America don't seem to be a huge problem so far. And secondly, I think you have this kind of essentialism about religious identity that ignores the demonstrated malleability of religious character. I think you and I both remember a time when Protestants and Catholics in America were thought of as more almost intrinsically antagonistic than they are now. I mean, I remember when it was, at least in my part of the world, when a Catholic married a Protestant, that drew a certain amount of comment. And now it's like they're allies because there's bigger problems for them to worry about. Now you're going to point out one of the big problems is the Muslim world. Well, fine, but whatever. I mean, another of the big problems is actually atheists. They're also united against that threat. But in any event, things can change in a reasonably rapid time frame when two groups of people see themselves as having common cause.
You're right. You're absolutely right. And the Catholic-Protestant analogy is one worth exploring. And I would say that, in fact, it was settled because not only did the Catholics and Protestants in America all spoke English, almost all.
That's Muslims in America too.
And were sworn in. Well, the problem is we have with the multiculturalists now is that you can do pretty well in America for a long time and not speak a word of English.
You could, but I think an overwhelming majority of Muslims in America do speak fluent English.
And then furthermore, you also and then 30 years ago, when people or a little over 30 years ago, when people in Iran were happily wearing women were wearing miniskirts, and they were wearing miniskirts in Malaysia and Indonesia and Egypt and so on, and Lebanon. I wouldn't have been so worried. I said, sure, we can have a kind of liberal utopianism of rising tides of secularism and so on and so on. What we've seen in the last 30 years, and there's lots of reasons for it, including the Israel-Palestine dispute, including the Iraq War, including lots of things, including also just the obvious reality that there is a sort of a reformation going on in the Muslim world, where they are sloughing off Western ways, and so people who lived in Indonesia or Malaysia or Egypt or Lebanon 30 or 40 years ago have gone back and said, "Man, it's all different now. It's all veils, It's all burqas, it's all Islamic Brotherhood." And
so things must be pretty malleable. The situation must be pretty fluid. If the pendulum is swung in that direction that fast, it must be that pendulums can swing pretty fast.
Bob, all it means is they're continuing their decolonialization.
Well, they're also responding to some, for example, American policies that I think you would agree were ill-advised.
I would agree, but the point is I would do both. I said I would oppose the Iraq War. But just to be clear, I would then say, look, we're going to reach a deal with Israel where the West, the king of the Christians, sits down with the king of the Muslims and says, we're going to make a deal here on Israel. And we're going to back it up with the full faith and credit of the entire regimes on both sides. It's not just going to be the United States trying to make a deal with the Palestinians while the Iranians are sitting there plotting Israel's nuclear destruction. I mean, it would have to be a comprehensive worldwide settlement that agreed on these borders between Europe and Islam, between Israel and Islam. I mean, it would have to be a big and comprehensive settlement where we looked at all the interests we have and defended them. But I think what's really, really clear, and so having said that, if the Americans were no longer bombing Afghan wedding processions by accident, and obviously that would help a lot to cool the tensions down. But I think the best single solution is to build a wall, is to build a fence between people who are naturally antagonistic to each other.
Well, that's not really the history of the way. The history of the way the world has worked is largely the opposite. Is ethnicities in America that were antagonistic, Irish, Italians, whatever, are just much less so. It's just an historical fact. Catholics and Protestants.
No, Bob, you're wrong, Bob. How did Russia and Poland settle their disputes? By becoming one country, or becoming two? Two.
Well, I actually, you know what? There's one place where I agree with you. I often think in foreign affairs, partition of a country can be the simpler solution.
And we agree on that.
But we agree on that. But the reason I think so is because once ethnicities become secure in their political identity and don't feel threatened by the dominance of a majority ethnicity or something, then they can do business together pretty easily. The world is full of them. But you don't want them to. You want to build a huge wall.
No, Bob, I want the Muslims to be over there in their countries, living their lives.
Yeah,
I want that. But the point is exactly what you're saying, because I agree exactly with what you're saying. That once you're secure in your identity, you can be peaceful.
Right, but then you don't even need the wall. I mean, the thing is, we have done a lot of things that they find as threatening to their identity.
Okay.
And in fact, one of the things you're suggesting we do right before we build the wall would lessen the need for the wall. If we solve the Israel-Palestine problem, that would reduce tensions. And there's a number of things like that.
Unless Al-Qaeda simply says, we for some reason find this war desirable, and so on the moment that Israel and Palestine sign a deal, Al-Qaeda sets off an A-bomb somewhere, just to screw things up.
They can do that.
Because what they really want, because what they really want, the Al-Qaeda people, is the Talibanization of Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and everywhere else. So their agenda is infinitely more radical than anything that we can count.
The leaders of Al-Qaeda, you're right about that, but how many recruits they can win, and that is a very important question, depends on what the world is like. And that's why they don't want the Israel-Palestine problem solved.
You're right, they don't want the Israel problem solved, but their point is their real grudge is against their own regimes that they see as sold out to the West.
That was their initial grudge.
All right, and I think that's the point is that's the way reformations are. Yeah. If you desire the purification of your country, then the foreigners are secondary to your real goal, which is to purify your neighbor, and then further purify yourself. So we're in. I mean, this is what sort of secular liberal utopianism can't quite come to grips with. This is where Huntington is so profound, and for that matter, so was Tolkien. Tolkien never pretended that the orcs or we're going to be good guys. They never pretended they were going to be on our side. They never pretended we were going to sit and reason with them. Mm. He said, look, they're just the enemy, and so you keep them on their side of the fence. Now, if over time the orcs become nice and so on, then great. Then you can have a nice, Orcan, Shire dialogue. But if you can't, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you can't, then you are better off separating. I think we both agree that that Sudan would be better off in several different countries. We both agree that Ethiopia was better off when the Christians and the Muslims separated out from Christian Ethiopia to Muslim
where it's geographically plausible, it can make sense as a short-term thing. But again, to very different ends in my model as compared to yours.
No, it's very similar. That's what you can't come to grips with.
Well, no, but you see this permanent wall.
No, I don't see. I see it as a strategy. I see it as an approach, and if everything changes 500 years from now, great. But I think that would India be better off if Pakistan and Bangladesh were still folded into India? Of course not. They're better off separate now.
India has a huge Muslim population.
It does.
And it's getting along okay, actually.
Well, there's been only a terrorist incident every 3 months over there, of some kind. And India and Pakistan have fought 4 wars. Since the 1940s.
Well, even though they're separate, so what did that get you? I mean,
it's separate makes it more manageable along the frontier as opposed to what happened in 1947-48 when like 4 million people were killed.
Okay, well, on the orcs, I would just in closing say that as a liberal, I've always thought that the problem with the orcs was low self-esteem, and if we had these self-esteem coaching classes financed by the federal government for the orcs.
How about affirmative action for orcs?
Yeah, I don't know that I go that far. I think the self-esteem thing will do it. But anyway, we're kind of running short on time. A little bit of in-house business I need to take care of. We could have a very long conversation on this, and it would help me get closer and closer to understanding exactly what you're proposing. But I do think, I shouldn't get the last word. I would only be reiterating.
No,
what
it's your show, Bob.
Okay, you're right. Jim, you're wrong. I'm right. And now it's time for a sign-off.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me.
Now, quickly, I got just a couple of commenter things. I want to start off with one. Maybe you can enlighten me as to what the reference is. This is from the commenter known as Kingfish, who is known as Ron Wynn and Ann Althouse commenter, and we have this ongoing cross-fertilization thing with the Althouse comment section. But he says, in reference to me, he or she, second, you may think you could invade Althouse like D-Day. My feeling is that you would be more like the Canadians at Dieppe, D-I-E-P-P-E, instead. Now, Jim, you're exactly the kind of person who know what the hell this...
Well, in 1942, there was a sort of a kind of an abortive... not a raid against like a German weather station or something in Dieppe, France.
There you go.
It wasn't a full-blown invasion. It was just like a raid.
Okay, I came to the right person. Here's something. Let me just get your reaction to this. I had been arguing. This is from a commenter named Jay Bergen, B-U-R-G-I-N. I had been arguing that Afghanistan works for Obama in the sense that Obama can say, well, we alluded to this earlier. He can say, look, the drain of resources to Iraq let Afghanistan fester, and now look what we have. Jay Bergen says quite the contrary. Basically, in people's minds, we've come up with a winning tactic for dealing with low-intensity wars in Islamic countries. That is by virtue of the surge. Okay, the surge demonstrates we can do this. McCain is associated with the surge, so his argument should be, look, Afghanistan's a problem I can solve. I think maybe we answered this question earlier, which is that we actually both think McCain does not have a legitimate claim to have embraced the philosophy of the surge in advance of it.
No, I think he's done more than Obama has. I think that's a fair statement. But I would say this about the surge and about Afghanistan and something is, look, if Obama wins the presidency, and according to the in-trade numbers, he's like 65-31.
I think they're way off personally, but go ahead.
Fair enough. If Obama wins, and then he decides for whatever reason that he wants to, fix Afghanistan the way that Petraeus fixed Iraq, and he sends Petraeus over to Afghanistan to do the exact same thing that they did in Iraq, which wouldn't surprise me. And he says, I'll prove to the world that I'm a liberal and I'm a Democrat, but I'm no weenie, and I'm going to do what John Kennedy did in Vietnam. I think we will eventually see a heartbreak in the Obama presidency, sort of like the way what happened to Lyndon Johnson. Because I don't think that any of these strategies, long term, are viable in these Muslim countries. I just think that in the end, the presence of white American soldiers in these countries is a guaranteed red flag, and so we will have to leave both places. What we should have done in Afghanistan and Iraq, both, is figure out a way to set up a client state. Use the Reagan doctrine of fight locals with locals. But the Americans, as the Duke of Wellington said, in a much different 200 years ago, said, for a great power, there's no such thing as a small war. And if we're fighting in Afghanistan, we're saying, look, we're here to protect Karzai. We'll be entangled up with Iran and obviously Pakistan and whoever else. And one of these days, things are going to become so inflamed in Pakistan that one of those A-bombs gets loose. And then all my theories about immigration control will seem a lot more vital than they do now. So I would just say this would be the ultimate sort of neocon grand joke on the world if they let Obama gets elected, and then we find out that Obama has turned out to be another Bush when it comes to Afghanistan.
Well, if vindication comes to you, I hope that's not the form it comes in. But this kind of leads us a little bit to a comment. Exeus99, a commenter, chastises me, and in fact says that I am the quintessence of hackery, which, Jim, I personally think is an overstatement. But
I mean, quintessence. I mean,
it's a kind of. I would have preferred apotheosis, but it's kind of a compliment. Anyway, complains that I was talking to Heather Hurlburt, and she was saying, she's a Democrat, a liberal, and she was saying, well, we need more troops in Afghanistan, and I was apparently nodding my head, and I get chastised for not taking issue with her, because Exeus99 thinks that my instinct is always to say, don't put more troops in Afghanistan, and actually, I do have some reservations, and the thing about that was we were just trying to move through a lot of, that was kind of an interview format. We were moving through a lot of material fast. I would have actually liked to stop and challenge her because, like you, I have some doubts about, well, I have two doubts. I mean, first of all, I'm totally happy with this Obama talking point that if we had only focused on Afghanistan, things would have worked out better. Actually, I'm not so confident that we would have used our military force wisely there, given the delicacy of the situation. I'm not totally sure, even in all these years of reflection on counterinsurgency in an Iraqi context, whether we really would know what we're doing in Afghanistan now.
No, I mean, I would go further and say, listen, what worked in Afghanistan was that singular period from like October to November, December 01, when we won the war over there with the Northern Alliance. If we put the Northern Alliance in charge and given them weapons and said, look, you're our guys, now you run Afghanistan, and then we'd left, that might have worked. You just can't do it. I mean, I defy anybody to point to a place where a white European country, and that includes psychically America, successfully presides over a Muslim majority. It just doesn't happen, folks. And so every time that some opium grower or Taliban member or something like that sees an American or a Canadian or a Dane going by, they get the same reaction as they reach for their AK-47 that Americans would get if the Afghans or the Iraqis or the Saudi Arabians were in America occupying us. At some point it becomes so reflexive and so knee-jerk as it's impossible to even see straight while you're trying to get these foreigners out of your country. And so I think this business of, again, I understand Obama has to say, oh yeah, more troops in Afghanistan, fine. But both Iraq and Afghanistan desperately need is a Muslim solution for these Muslim countries.
Well, I forget the name of that University of Chicago social scientist who showed that, exactly, that a lot of the terrorism, if you look at where it happens, can plausibly be chalked up to occupation by foreign troops being the problem.
Which again, this explains, why the British had a bad experience in America after 1776. Mm-hmm. You just don't want foreigners, and of course the Hessians further inflame things. The point is, you can't make it work, and there's just no place where it has. We're in a post-colonial time around the world, and Robert Mugabe is a horrible, evil man. He's got one thing going for him. He's got Britain and to a lesser extent the United States as bogeymen. And that guarantees him the allegiance of a critical mass of Zimbabweans, and crucially, the rest of Africa, at least the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, says, well, yeah, if we give the British and the Americans and the NGOs and the liberals 1 inch on Zimbabwean sovereignty in terms of Mugabe getting thrown out, and the same thing, of course, is true in Darfur, then the next thing we'll know, we'll be recolonized, and we can't have that. There's nothing worse than that. And I think we just have to realize the same thing is pretty much happening in the Muslim world.
Well, we close on something alarmingly close to agreement, Jim. I'll leave it for our commenters to determine how loathsome you were, and in any event, I will try to bring them a more loathsome conservative next week, and just escalate throughout the summer.
That's the thing about you, Bob. You and your sense of humor is say, listen, it's bad now, but look, folks, it'll get worse. So cheer up. That's very Wrightian in its worldview.
Well, I don't know. It's in some ways Pinkertonian too, except for the cheer. Even the cheer up part. I mean, your Christendom piece is like, hey, in some ways it's great to be part of an epic struggle that tests our whatever, even if it does look very likely that it'll end in the utter destruction of the world. But
remember in Tolkien it ends happily.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm for that. Another point of agreement.
Happy endings.
Happy endings. We like happy endings, and we will make this one then. We have just seen a happy ending. Well, thanks a lot, Jim. This is great. See you around.